Hello, and welcome to the U.S. Chamber Foundation's Path Forward series. Thank you for joining us. For the past 2 years, our team has worked to bring you the most up-to-date information on COVID-19 developments from experts and leaders, and we will continue to do so through these programs. We're also broadening our lens to look at things that will shape the post-COVID era, like today's topic, the troubling lack of trust in our society. Today, we see this erosion of trust everywhere. In government, science, the media, employers, even among friends, families, and neighbors. Of course, we all know that trust, or lack thereof, has become a central feature of this pandemic, and the ripple effects from these trends will impact more than just how we learn to live with COVID-19. Importantly, while confidence is cratered in other parts of our society, Americans continue to trust and rely on business to deliver growth, find solutions, and get things done. With that trust comes an opportunity and a responsibility to help lead our nation forward. And that's what we're going to start to dig into today. We'll hear from a panel of experts about the current state of trust in the United States. That includes whom we trust, the role of business, the data behind trust in the pandemic, and how to rebuild trust at the community level and beyond. Joining us today is Matt Harrington, Global President and COO at Edelman. Also joining us is Thomas Bollyky, Director of the Global Health Program and Senior Fellow for Global Health, Economics, and Development at the Council on Foreign Relations. We're also delighted to welcome Kristin Lord, President and CEO of IREX. Trust me, we have a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. Starting with you, Matt. You have been studying trust for more than 20 years, collecting data, turning them into real-world insights. Tell us what you've learned. How have trust levels changed over time?
Great. Happy to, Suzanne, and thank you for including me in this forum. It's such an important conversation. We've been studying trust at Edelman for 20 years, as you point out, and we've seen a number of long-term trends emerge. Over the course of the years, when we started the study, NGOs were the most trusted institution, and that went for well over a decade. But trust has proven very dynamic. Trust in business and government traded a bit like in the marketplace, very interchangeably over the course of the 20 years. For instance, in 2009, after the Great Recession, trust in business plummeted. And trust in government rose with the expectation that government was going to hold business, and particularly financial services, to account for what prompted that reversal of the economy. But more recently, we've seen that business has stepped up into a leading role as the most trusted institution. And there's a big trend within that movement, which is a trend away from authority figures to trust of peers. Particularly as we've seen the rise of social media over the course of the 20 years. I think the last thing I would just share is that in the spring of 2020, trust in government soared as citizens around the world looked to their government leaders to help navigate an unprecedented moment with the pandemic. That trust proved fleeting. And in this year's 2020 report, we saw that trust in government and in media has continued to decline.
One of the things that was interesting to me in looking at the 2022 barometer was this concept that distrust is now a default emotion. And I'd love to hear you talk more about what that means.
I think the implications are pretty significant. We now, I think, have to start with that basic understanding. And the optimist in me sort of says, in addressing a problem, it's best to understand where you're starting from. And it is an instance where the majority of those we survey around the globe in 28 countries are more inclined to start with a state of distrust before they extend trust. So for business in particular, the learning and takeaway there is take the credit that's being given and extended to businesses as more trusted than the other institutions, but also look to the fact that my employer, my relationship with it engenders the most trust. So go local. And it's the importance of local, I think, that's come out of this year's findings in particular, as a way to do battle against the endemic of distrust that seems to have seized people.
Gosh, I have so much I want to ask you. Let's start with what we were talking about for a second in the green room about societal leadership, and kind of as the trust in business grows or is stronger right now, that perhaps people are looking for businesses, or at least their employers, to play a leadership role on issues. And I'm curious both how that happened and what you're telling your clients who thought they could or maybe want to just focus on products and services.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, and probably one of the bigger trends that we've seen over the last while. Not to give a history lesson, but when we started our study in 2020, or 2000 rather, it was following the 1999 WTO Battle of Seattle, when you saw all these institutions have a moment of great unrest, and the dynamic between business, government, NGOs, and media was very strained. NGOs at that moment in time were viewed as the primary institution to address problems, and those that were on the emerging sort of landscape. That's changed 180 degrees. You look to today, and business is expected to step up. We had 85% of our folks concerned about various societal issues, whether it's job loss, climate change, et cetera, or cyber hacking, and their path to navigating that distress and fear is via business. That does place a considerable burden on businesses and business leadership. And my view is that businesses need to be engaged with their employees, be engaged in their communities, but use their own values as the guideposts for what topics matter most and in which they engage. So it's not an instance of you have to engage in everything and all, but there are definitely areas in society that your business naturally has a voice and a role to be playing.
When you say use your values, do you mean a CEO's personal values, or do you mean the business's values?
Generally, we mean the business's values, the organization's values, and the values that your employee population rallies against and around every day. And those are, when you look at organizations such as PayPal, led by Dan Schulman, they're regularly called out as an organization that really does speak up where their employees think the business should be speaking up, which are issues that are associated with employee well-being, the ways in which financial equality is achieved, and the ways in which they can address social inequity.
You talk about trust being local. So when you think about the business audience you're talking to, how do you talk to business leaders, or what would you recommend about building trust among your own employees or your own customers?
So, it all starts at home, and the top-down sort of hierarchical or pyramid of authority that had traditionally been the ways in which companies engaged with their workforce is really no longer. I think the pandemic has accelerated what was already happening, but it's an instance where CEOs and leadership teams need to dive into their organizations and engage with employees, both to share the strategy, the vision, the problems and challenges being navigated, but also seek solutions and seek common purpose in navigating the business forward, so that there's greater transparency and greater conversation that's happening between the management team and the employee. So that's a big shift and a big pivot. And I think we've seen a lot of leadership teams engage differently with their employees, and how they manage their communication systems is a big part of that as well. Because our study shows that the vast majority of employees trust their company's sources of information more than they do any source of information outside of that ecosystem.
That's really interesting. I wish we could do a whole hour on that, right? Really having authentic leadership. We're watching a lot of leaders now who, when they admit what they don't know, for example, it builds more trust. So I hope we'll get more of a chance to talk to you about that. Broadening the theme for just a second, you talk about this information environment that we're in. You talked a minute ago about peers being the most trusted and kind of alluded to social media. Can you expand on that a little bit and the impact on trust?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like understanding that we're living in a moment where distrust is the baseline. We're living in a moment where we have to navigate disinformation or misinformation. And the sort of flip side to it is that the root of engendering trust is receiving information, trusted information, valid information. So it really is the beginning of what's the sort of equation for building trust, and it starts with quality information. I think the respondents that we had to our survey seek to question, verify, and then extend trust based on messages that they're receiving. So a business leader has the ability to identify the core messages, filter the facts, be fact-based as incredibly important, and provide context. That's the other piece of this world of disinformation. People parse messaging to fit an agenda without actually understanding that it's the context that we're missing. And it's that context that enables us to have, I think, a society that can be trustworthy and foster trust amongst the various institutions.
Boy, it gets right to information sources too, doesn't it? So there's so much more to explore here. So we'll bring you back in the Q&A for more. But first, let me bring in another panelist. This is Thomas Bollyky. So you recently published a study that talked about pandemic preparedness. And as part of that, your data, I think, showed a link between trust and COVID-19. And I'm hoping that you might both talk about how you're defining trust and also what that data showed.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with this audience. So the pandemic isn't over by any stretch, but the planning for the next deadly virus has already begun. And how should we do that better? In order for policymakers to answer that question, we need to have some understanding of what is it that allowed some countries to do better than others in this pandemic. And that was really the purpose of our study with the University of Washington in the Lancet that was just published. And we looked at a lot of the factors that have gotten attention through this pandemic. So economic inequality, democracy, populism, healthcare metrics like number of hospital beds or universal health coverage or quality, pandemic preparedness metrics. None of those factors that are frequently cited had any significant correlation with outcomes in this pandemic. The ones that did, particularly on the infection side, are trust in our government and trust in one another. And that had a large effect in this pandemic. We drew the data that we looked at there from international surveys, so World Values Surveys and Gallup for government trust and World Values Survey for interpersonal trust. And the association we find was quite significant. So if every country in the world had government trust at the 75th percentile level, so trust like Denmark, or interpersonal trust at the 75th percentile, like trust like South Korea, it would have reduced the number of infections we saw globally 40% during our 21-month study period, which is 440 million infections. So that's a really large effect that we found.
So this is shocking. So you look at health insurance coverage and age and population density and all the ways you could prepare for a pandemic, and it was trust that was the biggest indicator?
Yeah, so it is surprising. What is in two ways. We had seen trust have an effect in past epidemics and pandemics. Really, the story of the West Africa epidemic of Ebola was trust. Post-conflict, low trust environments where when community-specific strategies were deployed, they were really able to turn that around. And that really made people aware of this trust function. But the fact that the effect was so large and that so little of the rest of our capacity mattered in a pandemic, in exclusion of that trust, really was a surprising result.
I think one of the examples was Vietnam. wasn't it? That they just had a kind of outperformed their peers, and it was trust that was the differentiator.
Yeah. So what is notable about Vietnam, and there are a number of countries like this, El Salvador, Burkina Faso, countries that did well at keeping infections quite low in this pandemic, but had on every capacity rating that we had, on all the pandemic preparedness metrics, ranked quite low. On our assessments of healthcare capacity, ranked quite low. Aren't wealthy countries, had every reason not to do well in this pandemic, have. And these countries, Vietnam and others that were low capacity, have done well because they were able to mobilize that trust. And it turns out when confronted with a contagious, deadly virus, the most effective thing a government can do is convince its citizens to take the behaviors or adopt the behaviors that will protect themselves. And that seems, at least according to our study results, seems strongly tied to the trust that those citizens have in their government and in one another.
So talk to us a little bit about trust versus fear, right? In some countries, a democratic country, you might be talking about trust, and more of an autocratic system, you might be talking more about fear. So how did your study solve for that difference?
Yeah, so what we found is in the study, no correlation between democracy or the inverse autocracy and performance. There's no question that you need to be careful when thinking about trust when you're measuring it in an autocratic society where survey respondents might self-censor. But what we found is consistent across democracies and autocracies, and on both measures of trust. So on interpersonal trust, the highest levels of interpersonal trust in the world really are largely in democracies. And on government trust, again, we saw countries that have a fairly high degree doing well that are both autocracies and democracies. So if you remove China or Vietnam from our study, it wouldn't have changed the overall results. So it seemed quite robust.
Fascinating. So talk to us about what you found about the United States. How were the levels of trust here, and how did it impact our ability to fight COVID-19?
So the US is anomalous on trust, at least on these surveys. In most countries, it's almost cultural. Countries perform fairly consistently within a range. They oscillate within a range of a stable average on trust. The US trust, both in government and in one another, has been in precipitous decline. On government trust, that's really been true since the Watergate scandal. And on interpersonal trust, the US had relatively high interpersonal trust really into the late 90s, and it has dropped significantly. So I often make this comparison in talking about responding to pandemics to what happened in West Africa. And that seems perverse to people to compare the US to Sierra Leone, Guinea, or Liberia. But what viewers should know is those countries actually have higher levels of trust in their government than unfortunately we have in the United States. And that has really undermined our ability to respond effectively in this pandemic.
Let me ask you about contributing factors to that, right? So there's been a lot of criticism of the federal government's communications plan during the pandemic, and kind of different instructions at different times, and maybe a certain lack of transparency or clarity. Does that add to the environment of distrust?
No question. So I think there's two ways of thinking about what does one do with these results. One is the shorter term project, which is in a pandemic or a crisis, how do we function in a low trust environment? And that's all the things you were saying, Suzanne. Consistency of messages, being very transparent, tailoring those messengers to the community affected. And these are all strategies we knew. The CDC in its inaugural guidance, pandemic preparedness guidance for influenza in 2006, outlined a strategy of addressing the fact that the US is a low trust environment and how communication should occur. We just haven't followed that consistently. The longer term project of how to build trust in the United States is of course also a challenge. And the one thing I'll offer there is we do see correlations in our study between levels of interpersonal trust and economic inequality and government corruption. And perhaps should not be a surprise that people that find themselves to be economically, socially, politically marginalized are less willing to trust others.
So switching the topic a little bit to what we were talking about with the last panelist about trust in business leaders, and you're speaking to a business audience, what role do you think business leaders can have in rebuilding or repairing that trust?
So trust is a shared resource in a network. It's what allows a network or a community to achieve things that a group of individuals could not. So to have that collective action. And it really functions in a couple of different ways. It functions within a community, across communities that view themselves as different, and across authority gradients. Meaning, so with your physician or with a police officer, with your banker. And business operates in all three of those networks. So with other members of the business community, with individuals that are maybe different, or different classes or different groups, as well as this authority gradient. And again, building trusted communities through transparency, clear messaging, iterative inaction where your performance goes well, helps build trust over time. So that's really the function I see for business, both in a crisis and in between them.
What about interpersonal trust? What are the key drivers of that?
So on interpersonal trust, it really is this economic inequality. It seems, again, it's correlated, highly correlated, economic inequality and some amount of government corruption. And that seems to be driving it. On the economic inequality, it shouldn't be news to this audience, but economic inequality in the US has increased. And that is going to be a contributing factor to how citizens in this country are willing to trust. And that's a long-term agenda for addressing in our society as well.
So if you could give one piece of advice or leave one message with every leader that's listening today, what would it be?
So on the political side, I think the lessons that we have learned in this pandemic are not the new ones. They are taking seriously all that we had done in preparation for previous pandemics and not throwing that out the window. That's really the lesson of this pandemic. It has revealed less about this virus and more about ourselves. And pandemics, to paraphrase Dostoevsky, put a mirror to the societies they inflict. And I think we have found, particularly in the United States, a fundamental lack of trust. And rebuilding that so that we have guidelines that can help us function more effectively in a crisis, and addressing these underlying challenges on a long-term basis is not just important so we can all get along better. What this study has shown in the Lancet is that our safety depends on it. So it really increases the priority of action.
So it kind of gives lie to the idea that a lack of trust would be more common in complicated times, in a pandemic time, right? So there might be people watching that would say, well, of course we trusted less in a pandemic. It was a complex time. But really, that's not what the conclusion of this study is it?
No. And we look at the trust that existed heading into the pandemic. There are surveys, and including Edelman, I know, has done some work in this regard, as have others, looking at how trust has changed over the course of the pandemic. And there, it's clear that trust has fallen in our CDC. In one survey I've seen, particularly out of the University of Oklahoma, that looked at the health sector in particular, trust has fallen even more precipitously among state governors. We still do have a high level of trust in local hospitals, frontline health workers, and your own physician. And particularly in the health sector, that may be an area for starting to rebuild the connections, the ties, the trust to function more effectively as a society in a crisis.
Trust falling at the state level. So if I'm extrapolating from other things you've said, would it be logical to assume that trust was stronger at the local level, at a mayor level, or at a city government level?
In the health sector, it appears to be. So you really see local health officials' trust being quite a bit higher. State governors, again, the results you see both out of Harvard and out of this University of Oklahoma survey, where they looked at the health sector in particular, really have taken a beating in terms of their performance in this pandemic. The CDC to a lesser extent, but we do have an effort to rebuild trust in these institutions because fundamentally public health is local. It really depends on the state level, local communities. It's how it's designed in our Constitution. It's where our infrastructure is. And that is really going to have to be a resource that we draw on to function more effectively in future crises.
It's really interesting because Matt said similar things about go local, as an employer or looking at government or health officials. So I'm sure we'll have more to talk with both of you about that when we get to the Q&A. But let me bring in our last panelists here, Kristin Lord. Why is trust so important?
Well, thanks for the question, Suzanne. Trust is important because it's sort of like a grease in the social machine. And the research tells us that markets are more efficient, that public institutions deliver services more effectively, and basically everything just works better when we have trust. Conversely, you can think of distrust as being a bit like a social tax, like a drag. And business owners can see this probably in their own worlds. When there isn't trust, you need more compliance, you need more monitoring, you need more levels of contractual agreements, you need more security. It just costs more, it takes more time to do everything. And I do want to add there is a difference between trust that is appropriate and trust that is inappropriate. We should be looking at whether institutions are trustworthy and deserving of our trust. And I think we should be most concerned when there's sort of a deficit between what we should be giving and what we are giving. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't just go around trusting everyone. Please don't give Bernie Madoff your money. Please don't look for your news from QAnon. Please don't get your health advice off random internet sites. But where institutions could be delivering more, can deliver more, but citizens still don't trust them or don't trust them as much as they could, there's a real cost to society and things don't work as well as they might.
Oh, I want to dig into one of the things you said, but let me try to keep my enthusiasm down and do one question at a time and start with, what do we already know? What do you already know about what builds trust?
Yeah, there is quite a lot of research on this, and we know a few things. One is that there's something called trust by performance, which basically means whatever people expect of you, do you deliver? If you're a business, do you deliver on the brand promise you're offering to your customers or not? If you are a government official or a leader, do you keep your promises? Do people see you actually doing what you say you're going to do? So that's trust by performance. It's what we talk about when we talk about democracy delivering. We also have what we call trust by intention. And this is sort of the why. Do people feel like you have their interests at heart and not just your own? Are you being fair? Are you being impartial? Are you doing things for the right reasons? So, really, when leaders, whether they're in business or government or nonprofits, are thinking about what they could do to build social trust and all the good things that would come from that, they can think about how do they do more to deliver for people and how can they let people know they're doing things for them and for the right reasons.
Is distrust simply the flip of that, or is there more to it?
I think distrust can be a little bit more complicated as well. So, for instance, one of the things that really drives distrust is our information environment and the tribalism and polarization we have in our society. When we don't take the time to trust things, people, or information just because they come from a person or a source that is outside of our group, that really has a cost. It could be information that would help us. It could be an issue we could get together around and make things better. But instead, just because of the source, we don't trust it. And that's something that people do when they're afraid, when they feel like other groups don't understand them. So that's one thing. And then I also mentioned the information environment. When people are surrounding themselves with information bubbles, when we are only getting biased information from any direction, by the way, it really contributes to a decline in trust, because you never see the humanity in a person who's outside your group or you might not agree with. You never see the good idea that maybe you should adopt, even though it came from someone outside your tribe. And so I think those are two things, that polarization and tribalism and that information environment, that just can be so corrosive to trust and ultimately to democracy.
I read an interesting book last year. I think it was by Malcolm Gladwell, that talked about another piece of this, which is we think we're better at knowing a lie when we see it, or honesty when we see it, than we really are. You know, that we want the truth to present a certain way, and we want lies to present a certain way, and we can be easily fooled when they're not. And so, you know, it's an interesting piece of, if you've self-selected your own information sources and then you've decided the only thing you can rely on is your own gut, you could really end up in a bad alley, in a bad information alley, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a lot of research showing you're right about that, Suzanne. And apparently, the internet has made us worse. We somehow feel that because we can search the internet and do research, where we actually are finding the answer for ourselves and we can trust it. Apparently, researchers tell us this is making us overconfident when they actually test what we find versus what is true. And you know, there are studies that show even students at the most elite universities who think that they are immune to misinformation or disinformation, actually, when they're given objective tests, they don't do as well as one would think, or that they would think. So I think it only goes to validate your point. So we all take a bit of humility and listen a bit more, I think we could be a bit better off.
We've talked a lot about in this program is how important expertise is. And we can't have the end of expertise because we've all learned the internet, right? So it's an important thing, I think, in building trust. And it reminds me to ask you about what you learned about trust and confidence in public health authorities. So we have governments around the world with public health authorities during a pandemic that people are hearing from, in addition to having their own internet information. And what did this reveal to you?
Well, first, to get to the point you made about elites and experts, I mean, I've spent a lot of my career around experts. I really value them. I think our society needs them. We live in a very complex time. But I think one of the things the last few years has revealed is how much people do not find experts to be trustworthy. And part of that is because in some cases they have shown themselves to be untrustworthy. But in other cases, they don't have that intent I was talking about. People don't feel like they're speaking to them. So I think experts really need to work on that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't listen to experts. I'm just saying that relationship seems a bit broken. And then when it comes to public health specifically, you know, I'm remain mystified at how some of the public health guidance we've been given got so politicized in so many different directions. And I think it just really reveals how frayed our social fabric has become, how much we have come to distrust experts. And you know, I really feel it's important that across society, across the country, we really think about how we try and rebuild that trust in experts. And it needs to be earned trust. The experts need to deserve that trust, but also really help people to have the skills to make good decisions about what they trust and don't trust. You know, this is something that my organization, IREX, works on a great deal in the United States and 19 other countries. And we find that this discerning information is a skill that can be taught, recognizing emotional manipulation as a skill that can be taught. And I think it very much feeds into the question of trust, because it gives us more basis for knowing who we should trust and what we should trust.
So you talk about rebuilding that across the country, and the trust and social cohesion that's so necessary in a democracy. Can you talk a little bit about relating those two ideas, trust and social cohesion?
Yeah, I think the two are very much intertwined. And if we think about our democracy, so much of why society works depends on people, on citizens, not just on a few people in government playing their role. And whether it's voting or jury service or paying our taxes or working with law enforcement, you know, we all have a role to play, but it very much depends on us wanting to play that role, both because we trust that if we pay our taxes, they'll be used to build bridges and pay for teachers, not to line pockets of elected officials like in many countries. It means that we have to trust that other citizens are also paying taxes and doing their part, because otherwise we feel like chumps. But I think that when we get to a point where trust frays the social fabric so much that it threatens democracy, we're actually getting to a point where it does put us in much more peril as a nation. And I would like to point out the National Intelligence Council does a long-term study called Global Trends 2040. They update it every decade or 5 years or so. And for the first time ever, they included social trust and social cohesion as one of the factors they were concerned about as a threat to the United States. And I think that's a real shot across the bow for us. It's a very wonky shot across the bow, but we should all really reflect on what we're doing to ourselves.
So thinking about the role of business leaders, both specifically in fighting COVID-19 or a pandemic, but also more broadly in rebuilding trust in institutions and in trustworthy experts, what advice would you give business leaders about their role in those efforts?
Well, first of all, to business leaders out there, thank you. You seem to be among the more trusted figures in our society right now. And as was pointed out earlier, that hasn't always been the case. It goes up and down over time. So you're doing something right. Please keep it up. Thank you. I suspect you are both delivering on your promises and also showing people in your communities and in your customers that you care, like we were talking about earlier. But I think all of us can do things to increase trust. First of all, by listening to others and showing we understand them. That's something that business leaders can do with their platform. They can speak up about issues that matter, but also recognize they can't speak up on every issue. I'm a CEO of a nonprofit. I face this too sometimes. I also think they can work on impartiality. One of the things that makes people feel they shouldn't trust others or trust the system or trust institutions is when they feel they've been treated unfairly. And one of the most basic senses of fairness is whether they feel that they're equal under the rules, equal under the law. And when they feel like that's not being applied, it just really corrodes that sense of trust, and it's hard to get anything done. So I think if business leaders can help us create that environment where we listen, where we work together on problems, where we really try to put the problem on the other side of the table and all come together to meet it rather than looking at each other across the table, business leaders can help to foster that environment. And because they are among the most trusted leaders in our societies right now, I actually hate to put this burden on business leaders because their primary job is to deliver economic growth and jobs and revenue to their shareholders. But actually, it turns out we need them in a broader sense right now. And a society that's cohesive and strong and united will ultimately be probably more profitable for them. So I know we don't always take the long-term view, but I hope the business leaders out there will. Thank you.
Let me ask you just before we go to audience Q&A, and they're piling in here. Before we do that, let me ask you to expand on that for a minute. So beyond the audience of business leaders, we're also family members and community leaders and neighbors. And so what about our role just as citizens in society, or how do we all encourage more respectful dialogue, more citing the symptoms of misinformation? Broadening from advice to business leaders to advice to all of us as citizens. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think part of it is don't feed the beast. Don't be another person piling on social media. Be the person who's reaching across boundaries. We actually have so many people in our country who are trying to solve problems, who are trying to reach across divides, who are trying to make the world better for others. And they don't get elevated as much as they should. It's the loud voices, the angry voices that seem to dominate our social media, our media, even public conversations these days. And so anything I think all of us can do to help make these conversations more constructive, more empathetic, and also to make institutions more fair, for people to feel like they're being treated fairly. I think that's a good old American common sense, nonpartisan approach that a lot of people could get behind. But it's not the dominant thread right now.
I love that we've been talking a lot at the chamber about businesses being loud, being as loud as extremists. And I think sometimes we see that in our own communities and our own families, that the people, the get things done people, aren't always as loud as some of the extremists. We have to be as passionate in our views about free markets, free enterprise, democracy as others are. I really appreciated that last point. Thank you. So let me pause for a minute and bring all of our panelists back in so we can start the Q&A. So let's see, this has been so wonderful. We do have a lot of questions, so let's see how many we can get in. Thomas Bollyky, I'm going to start with you. This question is, it can be hard to be consistent about COVID-19 recommendations when the science is changing and evolving. And so how do leaders best approach that dilemma?
Yeah, so it's a great question, first of all, and it is a challenge. It's a mysterious virus. It's a novel virus. It's evolving over time. We have lots of challenges in the United States where we have a multiplicity of health authorities that own different pieces of the response. So responding to a changing set of circumstances with multiple actors is without doubt a challenge. But a lot of it is being first, being correct, and being transparent about what we don't know yet and how it might change over time. And that clarity, that transparency, that being clear about what circumstances might change the advice that we're giving at that particular moment is something we haven't always been consistent about deploying in terms of our risk communication. And that's really what we're aiming for here. But no question, this has been a difficult crisis where people are looking for information from their health officials in real time. And the science is still evolving, so it's not an easy set of circumstances for sure.
But maybe kind of admitting when information is changing, and not just coming out with a new fact, but that things are evolving and changing, and admitting that that's how science works, right? And reminding people of that. That's really interesting. Matt, turning to you for a second, this is a question about social media and how much has social media's increased a spread of misinformation and therefore impacted levels of trust?
So it's had a pretty significant role to play in creating this environment or cycles of distrust. Over the course of our trust barometer, we've seen the trust in social media just continue to ebb away, where it's now the least trusted of media sources compared to traditional media, news and print, and other media sources. People have not been able to figure out yet how to curate their communities in a tight ecosystem fashion, where it's just the trusted sources that they have, but rather continue to be barraged by messages that are not accurate and are driving a particular agenda. And that's proving very challenging for people. And I think Kristin made a very good point about the need for good education on how to consume media as being an important part of addressing this challenge of disinformation.
Yeah, you raised that question, and we had an audience question that kind of matched it with it, which is, Kristin, are there places in the world you could point to as good examples in tackling misinformation and improving media literacy?
Yeah, actually, there are several governments who have really taken this on as a national priority. So I think Finland and Sweden are two countries that have been held up for a long time in terms of they educate their citizens to consume information critically. It's in the school curriculum. Everybody gets it. It's not a particularly big deal. It's not very expensive. I also point to Ukraine, and my organization works with the Ministry of Education. They have built this into their education system. And I think we see what's going on now, why this matters so much. When you have Russia, when you have other actors that are not in favor of your democracy, you want to undermine your democracy, when you don't know who to trust, when there's tons of disinformation, recognizing when someone is trying to manipulate you, recognizing when someone is playing on different loyalties you have, recognizing basic fact for fiction. It's just a very important and teachable set of skills. And I think the Ukrainians have really done a lot to show us the way. I'd really like to see the United States do more to embrace media literacy, digital literacy education. And it's already been done in Indiana and in Florida and other states. And I really wish more would follow.
Well, God bless the Ukrainians, huh? But I think it leads to another question that I wanted to ask Matt, which is there are people who benefit from misinformation, right? And there are benefits in when distrust becomes more of a societal norm. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean that's the flip side of the coin, right? And there are absolutely those who seek to sow division and achieve a particular vision of the world, and the font of disinformation works for them. My view is it should ultimately be a Pyrrhic victory if at moments and times they appear to be making inroads, because I believe the functioning and resilient society needs to be one that's built on the bedrock and the foundation of trust. But in a snapshot of a moment in time, there are absolutely beneficiaries of those who seek to foster distrust.
Thomas, question for you from the audience, and it's really about how complicated this phase of reopening is. You know, on one hand, in March of 20, things kind of closed on a dime, but reopening has much more nuance in it. And so is there a way that employers can leverage their position of trust to help the United States and communities reopen in a better way?
Great. It's a fabulous question. It is a particular challenge in the U.S. Because some of the countries that are engaging in this reopening effort now, people have looked heavily at Denmark, are very high trust societies, and they're relying on that for the ability to ratchet up and down health protections in their society, depending on what they're seeing with the pandemic. So they trust that the citizens will be willing to readopt some of the protective behaviors in response to changing set of circumstances. That's harder in an environment like the United States, where people might be distrusting of those messages already, that once you remove them, moving them, placing them back on society when circumstances change may be a challenge. That's going to exist at the business level too. And everything we said around risk communication applies to businesses and with their employees and with their customers, making it clear the reasons for changes in policies and what kind of indicators will inform those policies in the future, so that people aren't surprised when you change those policies, that when you start to adopt masks again in your stores, in your restaurants, what's going to drive those decisions, what people should look for, is very important in changing that guidance, particularly important in a low trust environment like the United States.
I guess I'm curious, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd love to hear each of your views on this next audience question, which is it realistic to believe we can increase trust in the government, for the US, for future crises? And if not, how can we create good pandemic policy in a low trust environment? Does anyone want to jump in?
So I'll jump in. I mentioned in our original conversation, Suzanne, that the U.S. government in particular experienced a surge in trust in the spring of 2020. And in May 2020, government was at a 62% trusting metric. That has reversed to where we are in January now at 51. And it was an instance of, maybe some wishful thinking. The government was in fact going to lead the way, but in those early days of the pandemic, the government was the source of our information. And where things began to get muddied was where, what was the action that was going to get us out of this particular moment in time. I believe trust can be rebuilt. We've seen it in sectors, we've seen it in individuals, and we've seen it in businesses. And the government needs to take seriously this moment of where they're lacking trust and recognize that trading in facts, being empathetic, and mapping out action that is something people can see happening for themselves will, the optimist to me say, will engender trust. And we've seen this in other markets, some of the countries that have been mentioned today, where trust is high. It's doable.
Kristin, let me ask you a question. The Chamber Foundation has civics education as a real priority. We've been seeing for a while the need for more civics education and understanding in our country to really bolster our democracy. And my question to you is, and I'm hoping I can come away not discouraged by your answer, but the question is, what do you see in terms of this lack of trust in government and government information in terms of the long-term consequences for our democracy?
Well, I mean, first of all, kudos to the Chamber for investing in civics education. I think it's very important. I do think civics education can help to build more trust. But I also think that, as I said, government does have to deliver. Government has to earn that trust. They have to show they're doing things for the right reasons. And that is a big hurdle to get over right now. I think if we don't rebuild some trust and the trustworthiness of public institutions, I think we're in for a long and bumpy road. I think it'll affect business. I think it will affect our children's experience in schools and growing up. I think there will be this tax that makes everything harder in our society. We already have a mental health crisis in this country because of COVID. Just think about adding even more distrust to the mix. So I think it's a pretty perilous situation. And I think, I have been part of a bipartisan group of people who've worked on democracy strengthening around the world who have some concerns about American democracy because we've seen these signs before. But I believe that our country has what it takes to reverse some of these trends. As Matt said, it is possible to do this. We know it's possible, but I do think we just have to do what Americans do, which is face up to it and deal with it and do it together. And I'm optimistic we can be successful if we put our mind to it.
Well, you can count on the U.S. Chamber Foundation and business leaders across the country to put our shoulder to that work. I am so grateful to all three of you for joining us today. I can't wait to continue the conversation. And I think this concept of the ramifications of this pandemic beyond physical health, beyond mental health, even beyond economic health, to some of the long-term ramifications are going to be important conversations. And I hope you'll come back and help us explore them. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again to this wonderful panel. We're looking forward to seeing you at our next installment in mid-March. And in the meantime, be careful what you read and take care.